and then another, and then another, and then they can all see. And they awkwardly embrace each other, awkwardly because they had been so terrible to one another. And the question that rings from the crowd is, why did we go blind, and why can we now suddenly see? To which the narrator responds, perhaps we didn't go blind, perhaps we were blind. Seeing people who are blind, blind to people who can see. And Saramago means that as a caution about the modern predicament. Aren't we all, in a sense, blind people who can see? Seeing people who are blind. Who doesn't know about the AIDS epidemic in southern Africa? And what are we going to do about it? Who doesn't know about the massive amount of incarceration that goes on in our society? And what are we going to do about it? And the question of waking up from our blindness is a real challenge for us as citizens, as members of a democracy, as participating human beings, as moral people, potentially. We have to wake up from our blindness. And this is a struggle. This is not easy. Suddenly I'm thinking about the fact that National Geographic did a survey of 18 to 25-year-old American kids. Did some of you see this? It's many of you, but they could have extended it right up to 64, which is how old I am, and it still would have been the same, I think. And they did a survey, and they gave people blank world maps. And 80% of you, 80% of us, couldn't find Iraq on a blank world map. And 80% couldn't find Palestine, Israel. And something like 40% couldn't find Great Britain. And an astonishing 10% couldn't find the United States. We love that one, and the reason we do is because we could find the United States. But the others, I'm not so sure. And that's a scary thing. But it reminds me of, that sometimes I think you shouldn't be able to, the government shouldn't be able to bomb a country that they can't find on a map, and that would lower the level of, of violence dramatically. But the point I'm making is a simple one, and that is you cannot know what to do if you can't open your eyes and see the world. Not once, not twice, but continually. And then to act on it, and then to doubt. So we all know, and let me just underline this one last time, and then I'll move on to education very quickly. We all know, for example, we all know certain things that we're opposed to. Like, for example, we're opposed to slavery, right? Nod vigorously. Okay. Yes, thank you. Whew. I suddenly thought maybe there wasn't even a pulse. Okay, yes, we're all opposed to slavery. But if you were opposed to slavery in 1840, you would have been against the law, against your church, against your parents, against most of your friends, against common sense, against the dominant metaphor, against the dominant discourse. You would have been a tiny minority. And the same is true in saying, you're for the women's right to vote, correct? Yeah. Okay, quicker. Good. That was good. There was a little less doubt there. That's good. Of course you're for the women's right to vote, even though it's less than 100 years old. You know that, right? And if you were for a woman's right to vote in 1900, you were once again against common sense, against the law, you were against a lot in order to do that. So the question isn't, are you a good person now because you're a conventional person? The question is, what is it that's going on in the world that offends your soul that you ought to stand up and say something about? You ought to open your eyes, study a little bit, and say something about it. For example, I can easily imagine your grandchildren saying to you, I know you were around when the first African-American president was elected, but did it really cost him $500 million to get elected? I don't know. I don't remember. $500 million. You thought that was democracy? Well, what did we know? It seemed right. And anyway, he raised it on the internet. Wow. That's great. But $500 million to become president, doesn't that seem a little obscene in a democracy? It does to me. Or your grandchild might say, were you around when there were 2.4 million of your fellow citizens in prison? And 3/4 of them African American and Latino? Is that true? Were you around then? Gee, I don't remember it like that. Well, it's true. And I'm only just raising two randomly. We could talk about any number of things. The point is that you have to open your eyes to the reality before you, the joy, the beauty, the love of it, but also the pain, the unmanifest that goodness in the world. So that's the acting, and then comes the doubting, and that's what I think we have to all be thinking about in this period of rising expectations and rising crisis. So, a word on education, and then I will happily stop and take any comments or questions you'd like to make. I think we have to reframe the discussion about education and educational reform. And I think we have to reframe it in the following way. Every school system, every educational system serves a social structure. True? Think about it. A primitive farming community, they educate their kids in the use of farm implements and growing crops and so on. An authoritarian society or a royal society inculcates its kids into what it means to be a part of that society. But one of the things we can note is that all school systems that in the modern world, let's take fascist Germany, Soviet Russia, modern China, communist China, medieval Saudi Arabia, apartheid South Africa, and the United States. All of us agree kids should not do drugs. All of us agree kids should show up on time. All of us agree that kids should learn their subject matters and be well behaved and so on, don't we? We all agree about that. So what makes us distinct, or to put it more abstractly, what makes education in a democracy distinct from those other systems? Because they obsess about a lot of the stuff we obsess about. So what makes us distinct? And what I would argue, and this goes to this question of reframing, is that what makes education in a democracy distinct is a very precious ideal, and that is that every human being is of incalculable value. Another way of saying it is the full development of all is the condition for the full development of each. Another way of saying it is the way John Dewey said it. He said, whatever the wisest and most privileged parents want for their child, we as a community should want for all of our children. Doesn't that make sense in a democracy? Wouldn't you say that what we want for the kids in Winnetka and Lake Forest, those are my reference points, I'm sorry, those are wealthy suburbs of Chicago. What we want for those kids, we should also want for the kids of the west side of Chicago and the south side of Chicago as a community. That's the democratic challenge. That's the democratic challenge. And it has implications for policy, it has implications for curriculum and teaching, it has implications right down the line. And I'll just mention a couple. One is the point that Dr. Kemp was on, which is it has implications for funding. How in a democracy can we allow some kids, by accident of birth, to have no access to resources? Some of you might remember, well, most of you won't, but in 1996, George Bush, the first George Bush, had these goals 2000 for education. One of his goals was that all American kids would be up to world standards in physics. And in Chicago, in our 60 high schools, we had one physics lab, outdated. Now, how are we going to talk about accountability of kids to, tests and so on, without noting that the government was not accountable to the very standards that they put forward, as goals for the nation? How can Winnetka have a world-class physics lab in its high school and Chicago have nothing? That's policy, and that's the implication of democracy there. But in the classroom, which is the area I'm most interested in, there are also all kinds of implications. Take the question of curriculum. One of the things about a curriculum in a democratic society is it would always include, among the many things it might include, it would always include a pedagogy of questioning, a pedagogy of asking questions of the world. What do I mean by that? What I mean is, it's not just a matter of transmitting bits of knowledge and so on into inert vessels that makes curriculum come alive. It's teaching kids to ask important questions of the world. And frankly, and the